This is the third video in a series on Modern Language Association guidelines for formatting works cited entries, and the topic of this particular video is electronic sources. Electronic sources are articles that students access online. They have the obvious advantage of convenience, and they're what students most often use. But works cited entries for these sources are also complicated, and they require more information than what you would need for books and periodicals. The greatest disadvantage of using online sources is the sheer quantity of material on any given subject, and the challenge as a student of judging the quality and reliability of that information. It helps to be mindful of the distinction between popular and scholarly sources. Popular websites are easy to access, and they typically have .com in their host name. While there's nothing necessarily wrong with using these sources, one should bear in mind that they're businesses whose purpose is to sell or promote something, which means they are susceptible to bias, misinformation, simplification, and sometimes deception. Scholarly sources, by contrast, are more difficult to access. If you've ever been trying to do some research on the internet and you run into a paywall, or you have to wind up registering, filling out forms and things to get access to information, chances are that's a scholarly source. And academic credentials are often required to get to these. As a college student, using your school's online resources, you can retrieve information from databases that cannot be accessed by the general public through popular search engines like Google. Obviously, as a student, you should avoid popular websites and use scholarly sources whenever possible. So the Purdue Online Writing Lab, again, we're going to go back to the Purdue Online Writing Lab and talk about how to format your works cited entries for a couple of really common types of electronic sources. And the OWL is your go-to for that. I've shown you this screenshot before. When you click on the MLA Formatting and Style Guide, we get this index on the left there. And in previous videos, we looked at MLA works cited page books and MLA works cited page periodicals. You see them highlighted in blue there. This time, we're going to look at MLA works cited electronic sources. When you click on that, it takes you to a screen very similar to the others with a list of different types of electronic sources. We see here, for example, a page on a website. You can scroll down a little bit and see an ebook. And for each of these, the OWL explains what you need to include in your works cited entry and how it should be formatted. And you can keep scrolling down on this page to see different types of electronic sources. For example, a listserv, discussion group, or blog post, an article from a web magazine, that's something that students commonly use, and then finally an article from a database. And this will be the most common type of electronic source that you use as a college student. So it's really important that you understand what a database is and how to format material that you retrieve from a database. So a database is essentially an online warehouse, a storage and retrieval system. Databases are not publishers. They don't publish anything, but they do store articles that were originally published somewhere else. So, for example, academic databases store material that was published in academic journals. Databases will give you access to sources not only that are not available just out there on the internet, but also that may not be available on the library shelf. So they're incredibly useful. They store a tremendous amount of information. We'll talk more about how to use databases in another video. Our focus here is how do you format these works cited entries. So we're going to start with a web page or article from a web magazine. They're both very similar. And then we'll move back to articles retrieved from databases a little bit later in this video. But a works cited entry for a web page or article from a web magazine includes much of the same information needed for a periodical. So for example, again, you start with the author's name followed by a period, and then the title of the article followed by a period. And in this case, remember, the title of the article is going to be inside quotation marks because the article is contained by a web page or a web magazine. And the web page or the web magazine becomes the container. It will be italicized just like with a periodical and followed by a comma. There may be, this is uncommon, I'd say this would be unusual for a web page or a web magazine, but sometimes they have volume and issue numbers, and if there are these numbers, you should include them in your works cited entry followed by a comma. And then a publication date followed by a comma. Now, all this is pretty much in line with how a works cited entry for a periodical is formatted. The difference is that after this publication date, there would be page numbers if it were a print periodical. But since we're not talking about print sources here, we're talking about electronic sources, there are no page numbers. So now we need to talk about what's the additional information that these works cited entries will contain. First, the publisher, followed by a comma. A DOI, URL, or permalink, followed by a period. And an access date, these three things. Now, where do these go with regard to the the 5 items on the left? We'll create some space to show you there. So the publisher will go after the title of the container or after the volume and issue numbers if there are any. Again, I would say that's uncommon. But unlike works cited entries for periodicals, you do include the publisher of the web page. So remember, with periodicals, you don't need the publisher, but with electronic sources, a web page or an article from a web magazine, you do include the publisher's name. Again, that's after the title of the container or after the volume and issue numbers. And the only time you don't include the publisher's name is if the title of the container and the name of the publisher are the same. So if the title of the container is the New York Times webpage and the publisher is also the New York Times, then you wouldn't need the publisher. It would just be redundant. Next, we'll talk about DOIs, URLs, and permalinks. A DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier, and you should always use the DOI if one is available. It's a short link, and it's very, very stable. URLs are really long, and they're not very stable. DOIs tend to be more permanent, and again, they're shorter and easier to use on a works cited page. If you don't have a DOI or a permalink, and a permalink is another abbreviated URL, which you could use instead of a URL. But if you don't have a DOI or a permalink, then you would have to use the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator. And that's fine. The problem with URLs is that they can be really long and take up a lot of space on a works cited page. So again, look for a digital object identifier or a permalink first, and absent one of those, then you would go with the URL on your works cited entry. Finally, there is the access date. And this is the exact day and month that you viewed or downloaded the material. When you put the access date in your works cited entry, use the order day, month, year with no commas. So for example, 13 October 2023, and then abbreviate the months as well. And to abbreviate them, you apply the same rule used for publication dates. If you need to review that, that's in the second video on periodicals. So abbreviate the months in your access date. And then that would be finished off with a period. So let's look at an example. So here I found an article about the TV show Santa Clarita Diet. You can see the title of the article is fairly obvious there. It looks like a headline. And then you look underneath it and you can see who wrote the article, Daniel Feinberg, and then the date that the article was written. And actually, it includes the time, 11:21 a.m. You don't need to put the time in your works cited entry, but you would need to put that date in, and I'll show you that in a minute. Some other features here that are important is you need to find the container. What's the website or the web magazine that contains the article. So look for that at the top of the page. Usually it will be close to the site's navigation bar. Websites are containers. Don't forget, websites are containers and should be italicized in works cited entries. So in this case, we're looking at the Hollywood Reporter. Since there is no DOI or permalink associated with this article, I looked for one. I couldn't find it. I'm going to have to use the Universal Resource Locator, which is up here in my, I guess, address bar. I'm not quite sure what that's called, but it's kind of long. I'm going to have to copy that out and put it into my works cited entry, as you'll see in just a minute. But I also need the publisher for this particular website. And to do that, I'm going to have to scroll down to the bottom of the page. If you want to find the publisher, always scroll to the very bottom. That means you're going to have to scroll through a bunch of nonsense like you see here, all these links and clickbait and so forth. You can find the publisher's name at the very bottom. Sometimes it's the same as the website, like I said, but in this particular case, it's not the same. I'm going to blow that up a little bit so you can see it. The Hollywood Reporter is a part of the Penske Media Corporation. So there is my publisher. That's what I'm going to have to put in my works cited entry. So here we go. Here is a mostly correct works cited entry for that article. You see the name of the author, Feinberg, comma, Daniel, period. The title of the article is in quotation marks. There's a period there. And then the container, the website, the Hollywood Reporter, comma, Penske Media, comma. Notice that I cut the corporation from the name of the publisher. Remember in the first lecture on books, I said you could eliminate certain businessy sounding language from publishers' names like corporation or company or limited. So it's just Penske Media, comma. You see I've got the date of the article in there followed by a comma. And since there was no DOI or permalink, I have to use the URL. The whole thing is in there followed by a period and then my access date, the date that I got the article. And I said it's almost correct because there's one problem I wanted to show you, and then I'll show you how to fix it. And it's, well, let me go through this. Website, publisher, publication date, URL, access date. There we go. Okay. So the problem is the hyperlink. We can't have you can't have a hyperlink on your works cited page. So what you do is you remove the https:// from the URL. This is not something you do with a DOI, however. If the HTTPS is in your DOI, you leave it alone. But if it's in the URL, you take it out, and then you remove the hyperlink to eliminate the blue underlined text. So students ask, well, how do you do that? How do you get rid of a hyperlink? You right-click on the text, and you'll see a pop-up that looks like this. And there should be a button that says Remove Hyperlink. And when you click that button, it will turn the text black and remove the underlining, as you see here. So this is officially a correct works cited entry for that article on Santa Clarita Diet. So now we're going to talk about how to format your works cited entry for an article retrieved from a database. The important thing to understand here is that, again, a database is not a publisher. It's just a warehouse for articles that were originally published in periodicals. So the first half of your works cited entry will be identical to what that entry would have looked like if you were actually citing the print source in your essay. So we're going to just review quickly what goes into a periodical: the author's name, the title of the article, remember, goes inside quotation marks followed by a period, the title of the container, that would be the title of the periodical followed by a comma, the volume and issue numbers followed by a comma, and then the publication date and page numbers followed by a period. So since the article has been accessed online rather than in print, additional information is going to be needed. So we access this electronically. That would be the database followed by a comma, the DOI URL or permalink followed by a period, and then the access date. And they all go right after the publication date and page numbers. Because databases are also containers, they contain the academic journal that contains the article you're using. Remember, the names of databases are always italicized. Just a little reminder there. You got two containers now. We have the first container, which was the periodical, and now we have the electronic container, which is the database. And again, they're separated from each other by the period after the page numbers from the original source. So let's look at an example. It's important to remember that databases do not publish the articles. They just store them for scholarly use. Therefore, articles retrieved from databases will have two containers: the original source, the book or periodical, and the database itself. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Both must be included in your works cited entry. So here's an example of an article retrieved from a database. So I've got the name of the writer, the title of the article in quotation marks there, and followed by a period. And then I've got the original source, the original periodical, which was an academic journal, the Journal of World History, with my volume and issue number and the date of publication, the page numbers, and then there's that period after the page numbers. That ends the print source. After that period comes the title of the database, which you'll see is italicized, as it should be, followed by a comma, and then the digital object identifier. And you'll notice that I still have the HTTPS in there. That's because it's a DOI. If I were putting a URL in there, I would be cutting the HTTPS from it, and then I have my access date and then a period at the end of it. So I want you to look at this partial screenshot of the first page of an article that was published in the academic journal Research in African Literature, which I accessed through the database JSTOR Journals. I just want you to see the title and the author of it before I show you the example works cited entry. So I'm going to put an entry up here, and I want you to try to identify the mistakes. So pause the video at this point. You're looking for 8 mistakes, and when you replay the video, I will go through each one of them. Okay, let's look at what's wrong with this works cited entry. First of all, there is no hanging indent. Remember, your works cited entry should have a hanging indent after the first line, so those 3 lines there should all be indented a ½ inch. Mistake number 2, I've got a double quotation inside of the quotation of the quote marks that identify the article. It should be a single quote mark there, not a double. Number 3, after the name of the article that I'm using, there should be a period. That should not be a comma. Issue should be abbreviated. NO period. Should not spell out issue or volume, for that matter. After the page numbers and before the name of the database should be a period, not a comma. Number 6, databases should be italicized. They are containers as well. Number 7, I have not formatted the date correctly. It should be 20 September 2023. And the 8th and final mistake is there should be a period at the end of the works cited entry. So here is a correct works cited entry. All the mistakes I just pointed out to you have been corrected. So what you see here is a vocabulary review. This is a list of important vocabulary that you should know. Now this covers all 3 videos in the series. So I start with the OWL, an editor, an edition, a collection, anthology, and then we get to the electronic stuff over there on the right-hand side. But you are responsible for knowing this vocabulary. And that concludes the 3-part lesson on MLA guidelines for formatting works cited entries, books, periodicals, and electronic sources.